All right, this is the video for Module 1 for EDUC 2110E. And this week you're going to go ahead and get started in the books. Hopefully you went and got the spring book, and hopefully you were able to get the Ravitch book as well. In the spring book, in Chapter 1, he's going to start off Chapter 1. It's only 10 pages long. It's very brief. And he's basically introducing his ideas of history and social foundations and how they're connected and how educational history has many, many different interpretations, as any history does. I think he just wants the reader to begin recognizing that, and certainly if you haven't already, that history is a story that is told from, a chaos of information. There's a lot of information that we get by reviewing, primary source documents, and how we make sense of those documents and that information is what we call, history, and how we teach it today in schools. And I think that the way that most people grow up learning it in the school setting, in the public school setting, is in such a way that we believe that it's this story that's told, and there's no debate about it. George Washington was president. Benjamin Franklin was one of the founding fathers. But certainly there's a difference between facts and perceptions and different interpretations of events. But it's how you take all those facts, put them all together into sort of this story narrative. And there are going to be people, obviously, coming from different perspectives, who are going to believe different things about how all of the documents of history come together to make sense. So, in Chapter 1 of Spring, he's basically letting you know that there's lots of different themes of historical themes that run throughout educational history. And it's kind of the perception or perspective from which the historian comes from that leads them to believe the things that they believe. So, it's not just this is the facts, it's in the history book, so it must be this way. He's trying to let the reader understand that it really just depends on your interpretation of these facts. There's a PowerPoint that I've included with that corresponds to the Chapter 1 spring reading, and it has Niall Ferguson in there. He's a big shot from Harvard, and I like his little snippet. It's about a 2-minute snippet of his version of how you interpret history. And anyway, and then there's a little snippet or video clip at the end of that PowerPoint as well. And that's just another sort of housekeeping issue. Make sure when you're watching the PowerPoints that you download them and watch them in slideshow mode, because in slideshow mode you can then click on each of the links or the pictures. Sometimes I have pictures in the PowerPoints where there is a little video clip attached to that picture. So make sure you click on the picture or the link so that you can access it if you watch it in slideshow mode, that is. All right, so Chapter 1, Spring. That's pretty basic. And then, so for the Ravitch book, on the other hand, you are going to read chapters 1 through 3, well, the intro and chapters 1 through 3. And her chapters are many of them are very brief. So, all of that reading, I think, only encompasses about 40 pages or something. So, but Ravitch is an interesting character. She's a very, very famous person in education, educational policy, educational history. She was the Assistant Secretary of Education under the first George Bush, and she has been around a long time, studying, historical issues and policies and so forth. And the interesting thing about her is that for a very long time, probably up until I'd say the mid to late 2000s, she was a stiff proponent of standards and accountability and choice and standardization and a lot of the things that she now rails against in her books. So she came out with a book in 2010 that was called The Death and Life of the Great American School System, where she essentially reversed all of her ideas or opinions about all of these different ideas in school. And it's interesting because, the reason that she says she reversed it is because it doesn't work. What she found is that they believed that a lot of these things would be the answer to helping schools, but what she ended up realizing was that all that many of these new reforms were doing was, circumventing a lot of what we have learned about what makes a good education, what makes a good school, and the elements of good schooling. What she found was that it's just not working, and it's not only not working, it's actually it's hurtful to schools. Schools are being affected in a detrimental way. So she's definitely an interesting character, and I like to use her books for that reason. I used to use the book, The Death and Life of the Great American School System, but I'm using the new book, Reign of Error, because it's really interesting that she also includes ideas about solutions to the problems that America's schools face today. So the discussion prompt that you're actually going to do for this module is going to be regarding the readings that she, or the chapters that I've assigned from her. The other reading, very brief reading, that I want you to do is basically sort of the introduction part to chapter 1 of a book called, by Annette Lareau, let's see here, called Unequal Childhoods. And very, very interesting book. If you are going into education and you ever have the option of just sort of choosing a book to do a report on or whatever, I would suggest this one. It's called Unequal Childhoods, Class, Race, and Family Life. And she did a study, I think it was back in 2001, about different families and why some children do better in school than others. It was a very basic question. And so she followed around these different families, and she really had an idea that, based on achievement gaps that we had already recognized between different races and ethnicities, that basically certain ethnicities, blacks, African Americans, Hispanic, Latinos, don't do as well as whites or Asians. This is just a documented fact, and one of the reasons that No Child Left Behind came about. So she was looking into some of the reasons that this existed, and she initially went into it really believing that it was race-based or based in some sort of maybe cultural element, who knows. And what she came to find was that it was a class element, which was tied, of course, to economics and how much money the kids' families made, whether children are working class or whether they're basically middle class or above that. Poor and working class versus middle class and upper class families have different, what she called them, cultural repertoires or ideas about how to go about raising children. And that's what that article is about. And for me, that article was very eye-opening. I did not read that article until I went back to school for my PhD. And I didn't read the book. It's not an article. It's a chapter of a book. Until I went back to school, and I had already taught for 14 years. And when I read it, I remember thinking, oh my goodness, this makes so much sense. And it doesn't say that one is better or worse. There's two different ideas about how working class families raise their children and how middle class families raise their children. And she's really not saying that one is better than the other. The whole premise is that our institutions in society favor the child rearing practices of one of those over the other. And so that's something to think about, I think, especially for those of you who are going into school, but really for anybody, who has contact with school. But the other thing I think that is very interesting about this, and the reason that I chose it, and I will be including other readings throughout the course to kind of make this point, is that there's a lot of social science research that gets done over history that sort of changes the way that we view certain things, that within education, how we approach certain, just things within education. And to me, this is a good example of that. There's plenty of examples across history. You've got Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or I guess we'll talk about the Clark Dahl social science research that he did during the time when Brown v. Board happened, during the late 40s and 50s. So it's just a way for me to help you understand that there's a lot of social science research out there that education leans upon, and that sort of changes how education is delivered, over the decades. So that's just that. Let's see, what else do you guys have to do? So, and then you'll watch a PowerPoint also with just sort of a rundown. I give you sort of a summary. That's what my PowerPoints generally do, is they give you a summary of the important points that I thought you should have from that particular reading. And again, make sure you're watching it in slideshow mode so that you can watch it's less than 10 minutes, I think, at the end. I found a little interview with Annette Leroux at on the internet somewhere on YouTube, and it's a really good interview of her and her work, and what the basic premise is that of her work. So let's see. Then you're going to respond to the discussion prompt in ELC, and that one is about Ravitch, and you'll be taking the first quiz for this semester. And quizzes are 10 questions. They're short. They're open book, open notes, whatever you want to look at that you've read and go back and review to make sure you get it right. Go for it. And just remember that the information that I'm assessing, I only give the quiz every 2 weeks. So the information that I'm going for is in the previous 2 modules. So this week's quiz will be over the introduction module and module 1. Okay? I think that is it for this particular module. And if you have any questions, please let me know. And I guess that's it for now. See you next week.